In 1998, I was still living in Haiti. And in those days, I was a Buddhist. I used to go to Buddhist meetings on a Saturday morning. And there was a woman who was Haitian, but she lived in the States and worked in the States. She was an air hostess. So from time to time, on a very regular basis, she had time off work and she would come to Haiti and just spend time with us and be back in her home country. And she was a very, very strong woman, very forceful personality. And I remember one Saturday morning, I went to the Buddhist center and I entered the room where we used to chant. And I was a bit late and people were already chanting, and I arrived from the back of the room and instantly I felt something was severely wrong. And it's almost as if my consciousness split in two. So there was my normal awareness of what's going on, and I had this sub-extra consciousness that could perceive something else that wasn't visible, if I can put it like that. And that other level of consciousness went, wow, something is so wrong. And I looked at Liliane, and Liliane was Liliane, but for me there was something profoundly wrong with her. I can't really put words, but I was couldn't even understand what was going on, because on one level everything was normal, but on another level, at a very profound level, it was like, whew, something is absolutely not the way it should be. And I looked at her, and the only way I could describe it was as if you see an ocean, and this ocean is usually very forceful and with strong waves and strong winds. That would have been Liliane's personality. And I looked at her, and this ocean was flat, completely flat. But she was normal, but for me it was like I couldn't comprehend what was happening. And then I looked at the room, and the room also was completely wrong. And I felt very strongly that some people were in this room that weren't meant to be in this room. And anyways, I went with the chanting, we had our meeting, and I had to be involved in the normality and the first level of living something, but in my awareness something else was happening, which I had almost to discard because I couldn't understand and I couldn't relate. The following morning around 5 a.m., very, very early, we got a phone call that Liliane had been attacked and she had been rushed to a hospital. A hospital is a grand word for Haiti, but the hospital. And we were asked to go and see her. So we went with my sister, and it was a very barren hospital. Imagine a hospital which is very minimalist, so you have rooms and places where a doctor is meant to do things, but it's like there is nothing or not much. So Liliane was lying, very, very profoundly damaged. She had been attacked by machete. So she was cut very, very severely, so severely that I remember I could see her bones. So it was disturbing being with her, and she was fully conscious. You could speak to her. I think her eyes were closed because she must have been in a very profound state of trauma and physiological trauma, because she had lost a lot of blood, and she was there on a table with nothing, no painkiller, no blood was given to her. She was just there. So I cannot comprehend the level of trauma inside of her and what had happened to her during the attack. So remember, we could speak with her, we could ask her very basic things, because obviously she was Haitian, but she lived in the States, and she had like a health insurance with the States, and obviously Haiti being Haiti, it made sense for her to go to the States. So we were asking her things like, where is your passport? Very, very basic things, and she could reply. And at one point she said she needed to wee, and a nurse came with like those plateau, and Lillian had the strength, I don't know how, to lift her body. She was quite a strong woman. So the nurse could put the plateau under her, and Lillian was yelling in pain. It was very disturbing. That lasted for quite a long time, where she was just left like that with no medical support whatsoever. And then finally she was taken away. I imagine they stitched what they could stitch, cleaned her wounds. Anyway, the last time, finally afterwards I saw her, she was in a hospital bed. She had bandages, her wounds had been taken care of, and finally she had drips, and I expect she was on morphine or some type of painkillers. She was receiving blood because she must have lost a lot of blood. And very, very quickly it became very evident that she was entering in a coma, but the way she was entering in a coma was very violent. She started to be extremely violent in her body movements, trying to actually remove the things that were where the needles are, and trying to remove. So I remember several nurses had to kind of hold her body, and she was strong, and she started to become very disorientated. It wasn't possible anymore to have a conversation with her. And after the phase of violence, suddenly she became more and more still, and quite quickly she entered in a coma. Then it was still early in the morning, I think. We were with Lillian, who was in a coma, who had been very damaged. So then other people came, people were in touch with our boss in the States and so on, and it was agreed that yes, she should be flown to the States and have proper health care, or the best health care she could receive. So someone had to go with her because she was in a coma, and if she was to come out of her coma, because she was going to move country, apparently it's good for the person to have someone with them that they can relate to. So because I wasn't Haitian, I had a passport, I must have had a visa to go to the States. I wasn't really working, I was flexible, so I was asked if I would go with her, so I said yes. So I think that same day, an ambulance plane came from the States. This American team came, everything was extremely fast. They came, they collected us. We were taken back to the airport, and I remember this very, very surreal moment where we were just by the plane, this tiny, tiny plane, which inside is an ambulance, is like a medical unit, under that soaring heat of Haiti, and Lillian just like a dead body with the wind moving the sheet above us, above her, and me really wondering if she was going to come back and be alive, or was she going and to die. And I was constantly speaking to her and holding her and explaining what was going on, because I felt even if she's in a coma, she's part of her consciousness is aware. So I was trying to explain to her what she was going to be transferred to the States. I was going with her and all of that. We arrived in the States, she was rushed out, and I had to go through the customs and all of that, and then meet her back at this very, very, very modern, state-of-the-art hospitals. Again, that was an incredible contrast from where we'd been in Haiti. So in that hospital, she was in a unit on her own, which was like a bedroom, but it was also an operating block. She could be operated where she was in her bed. And I stayed there. She lived for 4 days, basically. So during those 4 days, I was there as much as possible, and I was constantly speaking to her, touching her, stroking her. And because we were Buddhist, I was a Buddhist in those days, I was also chanting a lot to her. And for those 4 days, I had very minimalist amount of sleep. It was very intense, very extreme. And in a way, I had to let go of my desire for her to stay alive, because I was facing this woman who was in a coma, who was very damaged. Her body was very damaged, let alone her emotional body and all of that. And who I was to decide, live, 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 you have to live, or oh, I'm going to have to accept you're going to die. It very much felt it had nothing to do with me. Those answers were so beyond me, so I had to completely let go and just chant for her, for the best, way beyond what my ego would have liked. And the more I chanted, the more the days went, and it was very, very intense, and I was just chanting and staying by her. And at one point she was actually operated on her brain, because the machete had also cut in her head, and she had a wound in her brain. And by that time, the wound in her brain, well, I think there was so much pressure on her brain that she was going to become brain damaged, so they had to actually operate on her brain. And I just went out of her room, which was an operating block, and I could see her being operated on her brain, and I just watched it, and I was chanting. And again, it was very, very surreal, with no guarantee, is she going to live, is she going to die, is she going to ever come out of that coma, and realizing that has nothing to do with me, with my wants, nothing. So by the 3rd day of that intensity, I started reaching a point of, I didn't see life and death as duality. I started seeing life and death as oneness. And it was very odd, because again, it wasn't a rational process, it wasn't an intellectual process, it was just a process that was happening to me by the intensity of what I was living, and plus the spiritual energy I was putting in it. So being in that space of life and death is the same. It's like I couldn't see any more duality, I couldn't see any more separation, I couldn't even see why we've got those two worlds. It just seems it was just different facets of the same thing. I became even more free in my chanting, in my approach to Liliane, whether she was going to die, whether she was going to live. It was almost irrelevant. I had gone to something completely much deeper, like touching an essence of something that had nothing to do with her being alive or her being dead, or what we call that. And on the 4th morning, I went back to the hospital after a very, very short night, where I was probably even chanting in my sleep and in any moment of awareness, and nonetheless giving her spiritual support. I entered in her space where she was in the hospital, and Liliane was glowing. She was extraordinarily beautiful. She was glowing. She was exactly the same in that coma, which is, it's very odd, spending 4 days next to someone in a coma. And I was mesmerized with how she was. And I went, oh my God, Liliane, you're incredibly beautiful. And I couldn't believe it. And I went to her and I grabbed her hands, as I did every day, and as soon as I touched her hand, I let go of her hands, and I felt repulsion, because I couldn't relate to the sensation of her hands. at that moment, a doctor came in and actually told me that Lilian had just died. So in fact, I had just touched the body of someone who just died, and hence I had this sensation of repulsion, because it was the first time I touched a dead body. Yeah. So I couldn't comprehend. So when I realized she had died, I went back to see her and speak to her essence and say a goodbye, I expect. Long time. First of all, I never talked about that story because it was very, very upsetting, and I would start shaking, and I couldn't cope with the intensity of what I had lived during those 4 days. So again, it became trapped inside of me. But what also became trapped inside of me was like, how come someone who had been brutally attacked by machete, we don't even know if she was raped before, or we don't know what exactly happened, we just know she was severely damaged, then in a coma for 4 days, but at the moment of her death starts oozing a beauty beyond words, light, shining, be completely transformed despite the horrific manner into which she was killed. So that, for me, is something very powerful to ponder, and it's very powerful also to ponder from the perspective of where I had reached, of something that was beyond the duality of life and death and the duality of many of our thinking as people, because really the logic would have been, because of the way she had been traumatized and killed, she should have died in hell or in something dark. But it's not that I saw. I experienced something completely the opposite. So now I have some perspective on that, but that was a powerful point in my journey around death. What did it mean that Lilian at that moment was shining light and beauty beyond words?